Alright, greetings in the Lord, everybody. I'm back, Barely Preacher Man. And if you are looking at this video near the release, then you know that we are near the end of 2023. And so what I've been doing for a couple years now is towards the end of the year, usually not right at the end, but towards the end, I like to make a video just telling you about my 4 or 5 favorite books that I've read in the year and just encourage you to read those books, or maybe you have read them before, give you a little reminder of why they're, well, in my opinion, so good. And so I like to give these videos out. I have some pretty busy weeks coming up ahead of me. By the grace of God, I will be preaching the Word of God on Christmas Eve at one church, and then on New Year's Eve on another church, my own home church, in the coming weeks, as we see that the Lord's Day is both on Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve. So that has fallen upon me. I've been working upon that as well as everything else in life. So I thought I'd just make this video a little bit sooner than that. It's been a very good year. I don't get to make videos as often as I used to, but that usually means that I'm busy in all the right ways. This year is the first full year that I've gotten to hold my son Ezekiel and enjoy him as a little baby and watch him grow. And of course, another year with my wife is a blessed year. So family life's been very good. It's also been a very good year for ministry of all different means. My own ministry that I work, when I'm not doing videos or things like this, has been very busy, and we've been able to minister to a lot of people. I've been able to do a lot of work with abolitionists in Pennsylvania and other pro-life people that are fans of going out to the streets and proclaiming the gospel there and pleading with people not to murder their children. I've been able to, Lord willing, make a lot of good connections that I did not used to have. It's been a very fruitful year there. Pulpit Supply, I've mentioned, I've been able to be scheduled to preach the last 2 Lord's Days of the year 2023, and I'm very blessed for that. God has been very good to me and given me many opportunities as a young man to be able to use my gifts for His glory. And then who could forget my YouTube channel? I was, by the grace of God, at the right place at the right time to able to record an unjust arrest in my own city, and that video went viral, as many of you know that. If you're on my channel at this point, many of my subscribers came from that video. That happened this year, so it's been a really good year of ministry. And so I'm just blessed. But in the midst of ministry, one always needs to study to show themselves approved. And so what I'm doing when I'm not preparing sermons, lessons, or other works, and then of course all the other things I do with family and those things, what I really dedicate myself to is the study of the Word of God and of biblical, historical, and systematic theology. I love to study. I'm in seminary right now, so I'm always studying with that. And I like to study on my own. And so I have a list of books, which only one of them I had in seminary, but the others were just of my own desire to study, to show myself approved as a man of God and as an aspiring pastor and a current lay preacher and minister in other ways. So I want to share that with you. That's why I do these videos. I know a lot of people do these, but I just want to show you where the Lord has taken me in my studies over this year. So before we get to my top 5, I'm going to give 2 honorable mentions, and we saw them last year if you saw that video. The first would be the great John Calvin and his Institutes of Christian Religion. I bring that up because I finished this year, actually just recently. I started it in the year 2022 because I mentioned it. That's why I bring it up again. But it took me about 2 years to get through this great volume of theology. Now, it took me 2 years because I didn't just sit and read that. I would read sections of it, put it down, and read other works, and then I would pick it up. So it was an on-again, off-again adventure. But it was absolutely worth the time and energy and effort to read it. If you were to ever read one large book in your life, it should be Calvin's Institutes. Because John Calvin gives us, and it means, I think I'm accurate to say this, the first systematic theology, though it's so much more than just a systematic theology. It's a great work of historical theology. There's over 800 quotes or somewhat from men like Augustine of Hippo and Bernard of Clairvaux and John Chrysostom, even some Ambrose of Milan and other people in it. It's this massive work, but the reason why everyone, I think, in Christianity should read this massive book at least once in their life is because what Calvin set out to do was pretty much make a book that said, this is the Christian religion and how it applies to everything. And so if you want to know what is the Bible about, what is all of Christianity and all of doctrine teach, that's what Calvin accomplished. Honorable mention number 2, I also mentioned that I was reading through Dr. Joe Morecraft's Authentic Christianity, which is a commentary on the Westminster Larger Catechism. 8 volumes of commentary. Well, I spent this year on again, off again, reading volume 3, which I have in my hand. So I am still working through this. I have a long way to go, but it's an enjoyable read. I'd like to encourage anyone who wants to study historic Reformed theology, Presbyterianism, or even if you're not necessarily sold on all the tenets of Presbyterian, maybe you're a Reformed Baptist or whatever, wherever you're at in your doctrine, there's so much value in this commentary. And one of the best things about it is that Dr. Joe Morecraft is very easy to read, to quote, and the men that he's always going back to, the people he's quoting from B.B. Warfield, John Calvin, R.J. Rushdoony, an excellent work that I would highly recommend that you have in your library. Whether if you're a teacher or a preacher or you just love to study, if you're a layperson and you're not a teacher at all, you will benefit from that commentary. It's excellent work. So those are my honorable mentions. Now let's get to the best books that I have read this year. And the first one at number 5 is Alvin J. Schmidt's How Christianity Changed the World. Now this is the only book on my list I'm giving you today that I actually read for seminary. I read it for my historical theology class where I go to seminary. But for about a year or maybe longer before I picked up this book, my own pastor has been telling me, and anybody who will listen to him, that they need to read this book. In fact, our church did a young adults study group this year that I got to teach the first 3 lessons for on this book. And so this is an incredible work. What makes this book so good is that a lot of people believe that Christianity, it changes people spiritually, but it doesn't really change the culture or the world or society around us. Or at least it won't until Jesus comes back at the end of history. Some people think the world is just getting worse and worse. But if you read this book, you will discover that that's simply not true. You're going to read through so many different topics throughout the world, whether it be the Gentleman Code, care for orphans and widows, orphanages, the birth of the medical establishment, hospitals, music. Where did all this good stuff that we take for granted in the world today come from? Well, you'll discover when you read Alvin J. Schmidt that it came from Christian people. Christianity has literally changed the world and has given us civilization, if I want to use that terminology that way. It is an incredible historical book. If you want to see how Christ, through his church, has made the world so much of a better place over the past 2,000 years, this is where you want to go. This is a great starting place to just learn. This is not necessarily a theology book, though there's theology assumed in it. We talk about Christ changing people, the validity of his resurrection, you see some church history, but it's really concerned with just showing you how culture has been completely shaped and changed for the better through Christian people throughout 2,000 years of the reign of Jesus Christ on his throne in heaven, manifested through his church and impacting the world throughout. This is a book that you really want to read if you're not familiar with these things. And if you are familiar with them, read the book anyway. It is absolutely worth 1 read through, 2 read throughs. Have your children, anyone that you're teaching, read through this book. This book is so crucial for you. It is so important for you to understand the day we live in, that Christianity is not only capable of changing our nation, but Christianity is the reason why our nation came here in the first place. So read this book. Excellent, excellent work. Coming in 4th place would be Ian H. Murray's The Puritan Hope. Now, I have been looking to read this book for a while. I just never got to it. In fact, every book that I'm about to share with you today, I've been looking to get to for a while, and I never got to it, and I'm just so thankful I got to it this year. Iain Murray gives us a wonderful historical commentary on Puritan postmillennialism. He starts with the texts that the Puritans would read and interpret to build up their eschatology of hope in their day. And then he goes through the history, and we look at what Calvin wrote, from Calvin to the Puritans to men like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield standing on their shoulders, and even a bit of Charles Spurgeon, and how a lot of what he believed reflected the Puritan hope that we have here. If you're not familiar with postmillennialism or Puritan eschatology, this is an excellent book to go to. You'll also see, if you're a convinced postmillennialist today, there's a lot of people in what we call whether the theonomy movement, the Christian Reconstructionist, you'll discover that the Puritan postmillennialism, there's a lot of similarities, there's also differences. For example, many postmillennialists today, these are people, by the way, if you don't know what that term is, these are people who believe that Christ will stay in heaven, ruling in heaven until all his enemies are made a footstool under him, Psalm 110 verse 1, and Jesus will return at the end of the world after all the nations have turned to him in faith. Whereas premillennialism believes that the world will get worse, Christ will come back and defeat evil, and then he'll reign on earth. Postmillennialists believe that Jesus is already reigning in heaven and over earth, and he is steadily defeating his enemies. I said that backwards. His enemies in history. There we go. And that will culminate with the end of death at his second coming. That's kind of a rough definition right there off the top of my head of postmillennialism. You can do multiple videos on that. But the Puritans were a little bit different, because many postmillennialists today believe that Revelation was speaking largely to the first century and to the church then under the persecution of the Roman Empire, whereas what you'll see with the Puritan hope and what you'll see with another book I'm about to bring up, a lot of the reformers and the Puritans believe that Revelation was describing the rise of Antichrist, who they believed was the papacy. And they actually, I think, make a very interesting case for that. And they believe that Revelation was more of a book being fulfilled throughout history. So there's differences between Puritan postmillennialism and kind of the partial preterist reconstruction of theonomic postmillennialism today. But there's also a lot of similarities. An amazing thing from this book, if I could just get a quote, is if you want to understand what the Puritans thought would happen in history before the return of Christ, I'm going to quote none other than the Prince of Puritans himself, my beloved John Owen. John Owen did not make it into my top 5 this year, though I did read a little bit of Owen, but he's going to make it into a quote from this book. This is from a sermon that John Owen preached at the Assemblement of Parliament. And the sermon was called "The Advantage of the Kingdom of Christ in the Shaking of the Kingdoms of the World." And John Owen wrote that he said that God in his appointed time will bring forth the kingdom of the Lord Christ unto more glory and power than in former days. I presume you are persuaded. Whatever will be more, these 6 things are clearly promised, and these are his 6 points of his sermon. First, fullness of peace unto the gospel and the professors thereof. Second, purity and beauty of ordinances and gospel worship. Third, multitudes of converts, many persons, yea, nations. Fourth, the full casting out and rejecting of all worship. False worship, that's what he's speaking about. Number 5, professed subjection of the nations throughout the whole world unto the Lord Christ. So what's John Owen describing? Well, he's describing the Puritan hope. The Puritans believed that throughout time and history, Christ would advance his kingdom on earth, that the worship and reform of the church would continue to be biblical, that there would be many converts in the last days, They even believed that the ethnic Jews would one day, in time and history, return to Jesus Christ, and that would bring about a great revival. These are all things you can read about in Ian Murray's book. But what's important to really emphasize with that is the Puritans, the Reformed, believed that the best days of the church were ahead of them, not behind them. See, many people today think the best days of the church were behind us. But that's the Puritan hope. So if you want a great book to teach you just what the great reformers and the Puritans of the past did, this is it. Our next book, one of the most famous works of literature ever written, and for good reason, The Confessions by Augustine of Hippo. This book was beautiful. Augustine's writing style is just, it's beautiful. It's poetic. It makes one think. It cuts to the heart. It's very devotional. And what you're going to read in the Confessions is really, all of it is a prayer to God. So the narrative of the work is not, he's not writing to you and I or to people back then telling him about his life, confessing his life. It's like a prayer to God. So it's filled with such affection toward the Almighty, shame at his sin, wonder and amazement at God's mercy and goodness to him. The book could be divided really into two sections. It's multiple books, but there's two sections. There's the testimony of Augustine's life and what God put him through before he was finally converted. And within that testimony, you see the amazing example of his mother, Monica, who would weep and pray to the Lord with tears for the conversion of her wayward son. It's an incredible narrative where you just see Augustine's whole life, how he fled from Christianity as much as he could. He tried all these different religions and movements. He became an incredible orator and teacher, and he did all these things, but he could never find satisfaction in anything, and he was shaken by the Lord throughout his life until finally he came to a point where he was converted unto the Lord. And that wonderful story that you can read about in there, where he heard some children singing a lullaby, take up and read, and Augustine took it as a sign from God. And he fled to under a tree, and he opened the Word of God, and he opened it to Romans, and he read a verse, and he credited that was the moment when he was converted. It's an amazing story, but it's just a wonderful narrative of his life. Now, the second half of the book, it's good, but it changes, and it's kind of more of his just ponderings. You get some other really good, famous quotes from Augustine in the second half of the book, but for me, this book would have been second place if it was just the first half. But the second half, it was good, but I kind of lost the momentum. If you want to read about the life and conversion of Augustine and all that went into that, the prayers of his mother, the counsel of the great Ambrose of Milan, and all these things, read Confessions. Just read it for that, if anything. You can read the whole thing too. The second half is good. It's more of just his ponderings over time and matter and the world, and you might find that interesting. I didn't enjoy it as much as the first half. If it had just been the first half, it'd be one of my favorite books ever written. It still is on my list of favorites, but there's a reason why it's not number 2 or even number 1. But moving on to number 2, and both number 2 and number 1 will revolve around the great Jonathan Edwards in different ways. But starting with number 2, I read this year, A History of the Work of Redemption by Jonathan Edwards. I got really excited to read this after reading The Puritan Hope, because this is quoted in it quite a few times. And what Jonathan Edwards does is, starting with Genesis through Revelation, he charts out through the Bible and in church history and his interpretation of Revelation the entire history of redemption. If you want an incredible commentary from one of the best theologians who ever lived on how to follow the promise of the gospel from Genesis throughout the entire Bible, the Old Testament, all the foreshadows, types, everything God was doing in the world to prepare them for Christ, read a great commentary on the Gospels, on what Christ was accomplishing, the early church, and even a commentary that's rather interesting on church history and how Jonathan Edwards interpreted the book of Revelation. This book is incredible. I see myself going back to this, especially the first half of it, again and again. My favorite part of this book was his commentary on the Old Testament. The things that he recognizes, just the plan of redemption. There's only so many ways I could describe it to you. It's not like your commentary, like you open up Matthew Henry and he's just commenting on different verses. He's following redemption from the promises. He's putting all the things together, so you see all the types and shadows. You see why God brought this in and that. What was the purpose of establishing this? And it's an excellent commentary. And another thing about this book that's great is it's very readable, comparable to Jonathan Edwards. If you've read Jonathan Edwards before, he's challenging. He's got that older English. I've read The Religious Affections, a number of his sermons and things, and they're tough reads. But for whatever reason, Jonathan Edwards was pretty easy to read here. So I would highly recommend this. This book was amazing. But now for number one, this was without a doubt, and I knew halfway through it, this was going to steal the place for first place this year. Jonathan Edwards again, but not alone. This is The Life and Diary of David Brainerd. This book is amazing. Now, I mentioned Jonathan Edwards because Jonathan Edwards was the editor of this. Actually, David Brainerd died in Jonathan Edwards' home, and Edwards, with Brainerd's permission, took the diary of Brainerd and put it together and published it. And so through this, you're going to read a lot of Jonathan Edwards. But all that Edwards is doing is he's commentating on this. He's not stealing the limelight from David Brainerd and his teachings. He's just simply, oh, that's getting too high. He's just simply putting it all together and giving helpful comments to help us understand the historical background. So Edwards is there holding it all together, but the words that you're reading and what's cutting to your heart is David Brainerd. Now, why do I think that this is the best book that I read this year? Well, I'll keep it simple. If you believe that God has called you to preach, if you believe God is calling you to the ministry, you have to read this book. And you need to see if you can relate to David Brainerd. David Brainerd had a lot of issues. He had what they called melancholy back then. We would call it a lot of depression. If you read his works, it can be hard sometimes in the diary. The amount of depression that he's going through as he's wallowing over his sin and his shortcomings. There were definite problems with Brainerd, but he had such a burden for the glory of Jesus Christ and the gospel to advance throughout the world. David Brainerd, when you read about his life, if you don't know much about him, he died in his 20s. He only could serve as a missionary for so many years. You see, David Brainerd, when you read in his life, he wanted to be a pastor. He was a Presbyterian. He wanted to be a pastor, but because of what happened in his schoolings, you'll read about it, he ended up getting kicked out of school, and he wasn't going to be able to get the education that was required back then to be ordained. But some of his pastor friends got him connected so that he could be a missionary to the Native Americans in America at this time. And so he ended up doing that, and he only could do it for a few years. But he would preach, and at first there was just not many converts, not many people listening to him, but all of a sudden the Spirit of God was poured out, and there was a great revival in Eastern PA and in New Jersey, in the area where he was ministering to. I've actually been to a historical marker where his home used to be back in the 1800s. And so David Brainerd, what makes his work so precious is you see his zeal and love for God. If you think you're called to preach, you should read David Brainerd and see if you can relate to what he's saying. He has such a zeal for God, such a burden for souls to be converted, such a sight of his shortcomings. But then you read him describe what happens when he preaches and he teaches, and it's like the Spirit of God possesses him, and he's just filled with the power from on high to preach and to teach and capture the Native Americans. And it's a wonderful book. It's exciting, especially when he starts entering the mission field. That's when it gets exciting. But the best parts of the book are actually the very beginning and the very end. The very beginning, you get 10 pages of Brainerd describing his conversion experience, and it is incredible. The way he describes it, the things he was processing, how God was breaking him down and bringing him to conversion, an incredible testimony, one of my favorites to read about someone who was brought to Christ. I would highly recommend reading David Brainerd's testimony of his conversion if you only read one thing about Brainerd. The next is his death. It's a long time of reading Brainerd's health failing, his last words to his friends. Remember, he was in Jonathan Edwards' home, so he was slowly dying in there, writing his final thoughts there. He was preaching to Edwards' household, to his children, to his servants regularly. In fact, some historians debate on whether or not there might have been a romantic interest between David Brainerd and Jonathan Edwards' daughter, Jerusha, because she took care of him on his deathbed, and he wrote her a very sweet goodbye in the diary that he has. And we know historically that Jerusha died of the same disease that Brainerd had about a year later, and they're buried together. But it's just incredible to read Brainerd's works. I would highly recommend read David Brainerd's diary. If you only read one book that I mentioned here, especially if you think you're called to preach. And even if you don't think you're called to preach, if you have a burden for evangelism or missions, read Brainerd's diary. Because another thing about this book, you may have heard of this before, it's because this is perhaps one of the most influential books ever written in the history of the church to inspire missions. Many men after Brainerd were moved by his passion for the glory of God to advance to the heathen. From the prayers that Brainerd worked, men from like William Carey and onwards, just motivated by David Brainerd. So I would highly recommend read David Brainerd's diary. I see myself reading it again sometime in the future. Well, that is my favorite list of books of the year, and I pray that you are reading and you are learning and you are growing in your understanding of Christ and how you can more faithfully serve him. I hope that these books would find their way on your library and in your reading list so that you too can grow and understand what the biblical, historical, and Reformed faith has always taught and recognized. And I especially hope that David Brainerd finds his way onto your bookshelf. Until then, I pray you have a great rest of the year, and God bless.